Okay, fellow crazy gamers, tell me
Evening.
about some games you brought. I'm gonna let you guys lead on this one.
Yeah, well, I was looking through my collection, like which games have insanity and stuff in it. One of them is this one,
Aha, look at
second
that. Yes.
second
Mhm,
edition
absolutely.
Warhammer.
Yeah.
Yeah, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Um, there's this one, which is sort of Call of
Oh,
Cthulhu
nice.
Right.
thingy, and talking about Call of Cthulhu.
Of
Sure.
course. Right. That happens to be my edition.
Yeah,
I mean, I
this
own
is-
more than one edition, but that's sort of the one I always turn to.
Sure.
Now, in many ways, those are kind of pretty related, correct?
Yeah,
I mean, they're
Tremulous is sort of like an attempt to do apocalypse world kind style of gaming with a Cthulhu-esque setting.
Mhm.
And Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay clearly takes the
Right.
inspiration for the insanity and also a bit of the darkness and the world from Call of Cthulhu.
That
or
was
at least
precisely my
Cthulhu.
impression. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So okay. So the relationships in those two are noted.
Yes.
And okay. So you brought those. Hell, anything?
Yeah. The main one I brought is Cthulhu Dark, which is again kind of Call of Cthulhu, but really, really small, and with a kind of cool small insanity mechanics. I could talk about some others that have similar things, kind of out of memory. I could talk a little bit about Vampire and the things for hunger or that. I remember vaguely. I've tried to erase most of that stuff from my mind, but I could talk about that.
No.
Recently, I started play testing a game called Bite Me, which is about werewolves. It's a PBTA stuff, and it has some mechanics basically where you try to let the wolf out, and it gets out of hand, and you do something horrible.
Right.
It's not like a big thing. It's like a small movement, but it is there.
Right.
We could look into it.
Cool.
I barely remember how this works, but I have the second edition of Cult.
Good old Cult. Yeah.
The Spanish version actually.
It's very that's a very arty cover. I mean, I'm used to arty covers for cults, but they mostly involve intestines. So
that's the first and third edition. The second edition, the way psychological horror with also subtle.
Right.
But I barely remember how this works. So I don't know.
Yeah,
well,
I paged.
Go ahead.
I also paged through. What is it?
Don't rest your head.
Don't rest your head.
Nice.
That's the one.
That's cool.
But I never actually played that one, so it was like, I paged through it, and it's all about madness and being unable to sleep. But
I've played maybe once or twice. So, but again, it's not like I remember completely the system.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the fundamentals of what is obviously the primary phylum in role playing, and for which we can thank Sandy Peterson, I think. And so, Herman, why don't you, with third edition Call of Cthulhu clutched in your hands, why don't you tell us how it works? Because one of the problems with this is that people will play in a particular way in conventions and demos and events, and what's actually in the rules has a tendency to kind of wander away and get lost. So I'm not saying that necessarily has happened with Call of Cthulhu, but just in case, what do? We're playing out of the gate characters who are sane as can be, and then what happens?
Then they have a bunch of sanity points, like hit points. Something happens from small to a small event through, like, surprise to find a mangled animal carcass, which is the topmost on this list here.
Thank you ever so much for that imagery, rulebook. Go on.
Yeah. To see Great Cthulhu, which is not expanded upon in any much, but which drives you insane. Just
Right. That one just drops you. But
that's
but I
the
think
yeah.
along the lines of the rules though and the events,
Mm-hmm.
once we get past all the animal mutilation and
Yeah.
the the upsetting bumper sticker, then we run into things like, a ghoul.
Yep.
And if I'm not mistaken, every creature has its own little,
Yes.
okay, see me, roll. And there's
Yeah. Most of them have a
Mm.
sanity loss thing from like a bug-like insect-like creature is 0 1d4, 0 if you make your roll, 1d4 if you miss,
right.
to something like let's see if I can find a great old one which has a set rating of 1d10, 1d100.
Right. So some you can kind of tough your way through with a roll, and
Yeah.
if you
Mm.
only if you lose some. Now, what I think is particularly important here is what in that edition, which is the one I played actually the most.
Mhm.
Tell us about what it means to lose sanity. I mean, it's more than just hit points. I mean, you go
Yeah.
down, but there are
Yeah.
quanta of loss, so that matters.
To go insane, see below. And if the sanity points go below 0, you're otherwise it's a temporary insanity, which lasts a number of rounds or hours or whatever.
How do you
And
go
if it's
temporarily insane?
by failing a roll,
Right.
sanity
Okay.
roll.
Okay.
That's the short the short ones. And indefinite insanity, if you lose 20% or more of the current sanity points in 1 game hour, you go indefinitely insane. And there's a table for indefinite insanities, like what happens to you, and a whole list of phobias and fetishes and stuff, which
But let's focus on that. I mean, just writing it
yeah.
down or saying that is one thing. The interesting
Mm-hmm.
thing about this part, you see, because I've never been very interested in the character is gibbering and gets locked in an asylum and is done. So it is like hit points. You go all the way down
Yeah.
and you lose
Mhm.
your character. That's boring. I'm interested in that median level where you may or
Yeah.
may not fail the roll, and you may or may not, and how much you lose is also dependent on a roll.
Yeah.
And so then there's this temporarily insane business, and then there's also the even if you go indefinitely insane,
Yeah, you're not.
you
You're still have your character. You
right,
still can
you're
play your
just
character.
you're
You
just
just
pretty
have
bonkers at this point.
yeah.
And so the interesting thing is to continue to play. Now, this really interests me because
Mm-hmm.
here, depending on the tone of a game of Call of Cthulhu, you can go for a little bit of comedy. If you go completely comedic, that's one thing. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, everybody just gets to act funny at the con game. But there's more of, but I'm thinking more of black comedy and occasional seriousness, so that you end up with some degree of actually playing mental disorders,
Yes.
Mm.
right? And so just kind of holding it down, what I really want to call attention to is that in that game, as I recall it, and as you're describing, there's a
Mm-hmm.
pretty broad window for one or more characters to be pretty
Yeah.
edgy or even over the edge, but still playable.
Mm.
You see,
I
that's what I'm
think what.
interested in. I'm not interested in losing the character. I'm interested in that little
Yeah.
when we're playing when all of us are getting a little bent, right? You've lost some sanity, when you saw that thing, and you're all better now, but we all know that your resistance roll is that much lower.
Yeah.
And this other person, on the other hand, has acquired this, phobia and is otherwise completely stalwart. But if they ever see, they ever see a cat with green eyes again, that's it for
Mm.
them. This scene.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
okay. That's the rule. Go ahead, Herman. What?
Yeah. Now I recall from one of the games we played a quite long campaign of Masks of Nyarlathotep.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, people gained a couple of insanities during the play of the whole campaign because it was, and we lost, I think, one character to insanity totally. But one guy I think he got megalomania, so he was just convinced he could do anything and played that he could do anything.
In a lot of ways,
Mm.
this starts looking as a means toward heightened characterization. Admittedly extreme, but it's where I think a lot of people found value in Call of Cthulhu, in that you weren't playing a tactical piece.
Mm-hmm.
If you were interested in playing this game, you were interested in the somewhat quirky but also consequential aspects of these new descriptors for your character.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually, let's kind of think about that. It's process based, it's can be traced to actual events in the game, and it turns into things that you're supposed to and presumably enjoy playing. And this is where this whole picture of you don't get so attached to your character that you can't stand walking them into certain death. My character is megalomaniacal. Any gamer worth his or her salt is not going to go walking the character into that door. And and we all look at that character, and we all look at each other and go, "Oh no, there he goes."
Mm-hmm.
And that's the payoff, I think, for the player, when the other players appreciate that. And so, yes, you may lose your character, but you're getting the big gold star, right, for doing this. And and besides, creatively, it can be kind of fun. Well, from that trajectory, then I think you're right that the Warhammer basically kind of adopts that almost whole cloth, or very close.
Yeah,
you can correct me.
Some minor variations, but the idea is very similar.
And there are a lot of other games that are not very well known, I think, that going up through the early 90s, which do interesting things with this. The fantasy game that I've written about a lot, Legendary Lives, has sanity rules that are fairly similar as well. Another thing about the Call of Cthulhu rules and the Legendary Lives rules are similar is the death spiral. The more you lose, the more likely it is you'll lose the next time. So it's an exponential. Well, I drew an exponential curve up, but what I really mean is, an exponential curve going down.
And Cthulhu also has the thing where you learn more about the Cthulhu mythos, which brings down your maximum sanity. So the more you learn about the world, the better you might be able to guess what's happening.
But ignorance is bliss. You're not going into there is no bliss there.
No.
So okay, and I was really thinking, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought, wait a minute, this is crazy. This is so standardized through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of games. This basic model. And there are some very interesting variants. Another game from the early 90s, which I think is very undeservedly forgotten. I think it's very, very much deserves memory, is Shattered Dreams, which is one of the Dreamwalker games. And where the characters are all people who travel around in people's dreams. And I think it's the best of the bunch of those. I've always loved. I mean, it reads like a mess. It reads intensely frustrating, and then you play it and you're going, oh wow, all that crazy stuff in there is really working together. And a lot of it had to do with manipulating perceived reality. And you quickly then realize that all the characters are a little bit nuts. They're all a little bit, and they've got one supplement that really focuses on that as an important part of play. And so, without going into great deal, I think that some of the games, instead of just adopting Call of Cthulhu and making it a little simpler maybe, or making it a little more directed toward this or that, but what I want to focus on is consequences. Is what does the character do because they're a little nuts? How do you play them differently? What goes on?
I could talk Cthulhu Dark, and it's cool in the way it makes the same thing perhaps more simple and integrates it into every role, but it is basically the same idea with a little bit like in a little more simple way and more elegant way. I could talk about Cool that has a little bit a few interesting stuff, and if you want to talk about the edges of edges, we could talk about Malkavian in Vampire.
You see, this is the interesting thing. I do want to get to it. Malkavian is really the way to go with what I'm talking about, but maybe we should talk about Cyberpunk first. Because Cyberpunk provided the scaffold on which the vampire system and the other White Wolf mechanics is built in Cyberpunk. And I'm a purist and an old bastard, so I never call it Cyberpunk 2013. Here we go. Here, watch me lean off to my screen here. All right, and so you have a score called empathy. Empathy has a particular value, a starting value, and it's got the same scope as a characteristic. And in that game, when you have cyberware installed, you roll and it drops your empathy. And your empathy roll is diminished because it is pretty much a score. And furthermore, it doesn't come back. That's one of the interesting things about that game. You don't get over it. So if you ever have more cyberware installed, that's your new threshold, and it drops down from there. And that game, the original version, is notably unforgiving about this. And so, really, unless you just want a couple of cool little gadgets, you're gonna be way down low. And when you hit these thresholds that they have listed, your behavior is mandated to change. So you become less and less and less capable of empathy, and they call it cyber psychosis. I mean, when you hit these lower levels, you are simply psychotic. You can't behave empathically. You don't have the basis for behaving empathically. Now, it was so unforgiving that it became uninteresting. Not only was it easier to lose as you went down, but you also were mandated to play exactly that way at these particular levels. So there was no way to sort of pull yourself out of it through your own behavior. And so you can see how it's got something in common with Call of Cthulhu. A couple of things are different. One, it is a score that is used for certain skills, so those skills drop. Second, the behavior is very mandated, and it's very unforgiving. You're not really coming back. And third, it is external. And this is what I really wanted to focus on with Call of Cthulhu. It's not your own behavior that produces the check. It's something you see in Call of Cthulhu. Yep. In Cyberpunk, it's something you have implanted in you. And in most of the other games I'm talking about, again, it's something you see, something you experience, a particular power is used on you, something like that. So it's very much coming in on the character. So far, so good on that model, right?
Yeah.
Now, I believe I just described humanity and vampire.
It sounds very similar.
Yeah.
At least
the very early version is the first version is really the only version of vampire I know. Which,
for me, the only version I know is the 20th anniversary. That's one of my favorite RPGs. The thing with vampire is that humanity goes up and down depending of the things you do and how do you behave. And there's kind of a list of criteria that says, if you are here, you can do these kind of things, but if you do any from below, you are you go down in humanity. I think it is voted or is decided at the end of the session or something like that.
That's interesting. I remember it being a little more mechanical in the version I knew. Now, what's different and important is that we're talking about behaviors that you yourself produce.
Yes.
That's a big shift right there, and non-trivial, really. Yeah,
but with other mechanics, which I don't remember the name at all because they have fancy Latin sounding names. But basically, when you are low on blood, I think you are in danger of losing control. I think getting to a frenzy or something like that.
Frenzy, yes, that's the right.
Right. And that's basically the GM takes control of your character for like a scene or whatever, and you do some horrible shit. So there's that level of you may do it, you may lose humanity unwillingly.
Right. And there's another aspect to it, as I recall, which is that when you are at lower levels of humanity, your range of behaviors is restricted. And I don't know if that was maintained through the later editions. And I'll have to double check it to be sure if I'm remembering correctly. But that actually was an important point. I used the cyberpunk model when I wrote Sorcerer but I completely disconnected it from sanity. It was all morality. And not only that, but I also said that your full range of behavior is always accessible no matter what the score is. Because I didn't want you to be like, okay, you dropped and now you can't do the things that, could help you go up. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So anyway, my impression was that, however, from way back when, is that the original vampire mechanics were extremely similar, if not identical, to those of Cyberpunk.
Yeah.
So
for what I'm seeing, and this is quite kind of interesting, in Vampire latest editions, when you go down in humanity, is that you become you are able to do more stuff normally. Like for example, when you are in humanity 4, you say it says the blah, 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 humanity of 4 indicates that killing is acceptable to the kindred so long as his victim is deserving, blah, blah, blah. And the lower you go down, the more okay you are with doing horrible stuff. So
right, you'll kill anybody if you're hungry, if you're down at 2 or something like that.
Yeah.
Right, so it's more about opening up the badness. It's sort of interesting that it sort of presupposes the constraints at the higher levels of humanity. If you have these higher levels, then there are things you won't do.
I'm pretty sure there's some downsides to humanity. Like you have to sleep for longer.
Interesting. Yeah, that's way more nuanced than it was in the original
you look
version.
more vampire-like.
Right.
You instill more fear into humans, that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah, I would, if I'm recalling correctly, the original has nothing of the kind. It's but frenzy is still a big deal.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now then we can look at cult, which I think is in this same family.
With a twist.
Yeah.
In cult, everyone starts with their own problems. They have, I think they call them disadvantages,
yes,
or something like that.
Yeah.
Basically, everyone some kind starts with like a horrible past.
Yes.
Like it witnessed a crime.
Your parents were cannibals, or right, something. I remember that.
Yeah, whatever, something out of the pages of a Clive Barker book.
Absolutely.
Whatever. Right. And then you have this kind of slider of what do they call it? Ego, maybe. Mental equilibrium, something like that. Basically, you can have a mental equilibrium of a positive mental equilibrium or a negative mental equilibrium.
Yes, I remember this too. This was also tied to the interesting notion that as the crazier the characters got, the more they actually operated functionally in the metaphysics of all the monsters.
Yes,
Because it
and
was
the thing is,
that was the thing. They even had a thing where you finally made a flip and your character was basically insane.
awoke.
But
Yeah,
now you can actually operate in the same space as the bad things, and
yeah.
you in some ways were finally freed of the illusion.
And that's the thing that happens regardless of if you go up or down. It's kind of
Oh,
two
right,
different
right.
paths to the same way. The positive one is this kind of Buddhist,
Right.
leaving all your feelings and your attachment behind, and the negative is more like getting to the
Right,
all
you're a
the
psychotic. Yeah,
blood
yeah.
of the frenzy of the meat and Satanism and all of that kind of ideologies of worship of the material.
Yeah, as I recall, that was a pretty sophisticated system. I remember liking it. Also had a huge impact on Sorcerer. And one of the things that I didn't use from it was the idea of the real world as an illusion. That's one thing I really, really didn't do in Sorcerer whatsoever. But I did like the ideas of many paths to what I was calling the loss of humanity.
Yeah.
But but it is also kind of interesting in Cult that the metric, if not saying it is, but should it be a player priority to kind of try and keep their character as normal as possible, then they kind of don't want to develop, in either direction, or they want to balance out these things, and that becomes more and more difficult and less even desirable after a while. I mean, you can't combat the bad things unless you can see them coming, or hunt them down, or know where to go, and be sort of part of that world. But on the other hand, yes, by that point, your characters are quite bent.
Yeah, I think the mechanics of actually like leaving humanity behind, I don't think it's really thought to get to that point ever.
Right.
Like the amount of points you have to go in one direction is just almost impossible in any like normal campaign.
Right. That is actually another interesting thing too, though, is that like Call of Cthulhu, you are in the most interesting period is when you're in the middle of such a process.
Yeah.
And so I want to focus on that because that's where, in so many cases, what you have are characters who will behave not because they're insane, that is to say, dysfunctional, but that they will become stressed and act out unpredictably, irrationally, or counterproductively in some way. And the big game for that from the mid 90s, as well as Cult and these related, I mean, it's another variant on, okay, well, how do we mess with this model, is Unknown Armies.
Oh, yeah.
My friend Jared Sorensen can't make it to this seminar tonight, but he was very interested and insisted that I bring in Unknown Armies. And it has its madness meters, which are interestingly, and of course I didn't review it too carefully. First of all, there are 3 of them, at least, 3 or 4. And also, they too have a sliding scale between extremes, so that, for example, you may be shattered and freaked out at violence, but on the other hand, at that far end, you are cold and unflinching and dehumanized about it. And so you slip, each madness meter has its thing, but you also fail checks, is what I'm getting at. When you fail a check, then you as one GM that Jared talked about did it, would say fight, flight, or freeze, and you say which one, and then he takes over the character and and plays them accordingly. So one is that the character behaves in some uncontrolled fashion, and we've seen it through many of the things we've talked about, right? The frenzy and all these other different things. And that falls into 2 subsets. One is controlled by you. The other is controlled by someone else. So the interesting thing here is that certain things that are often thought of as undesirable, or at least at face value, you might say are undesirable in role playing. One, my character behaves non-optimally. Number one. And then 2, the extreme version, someone else is actually saying what the character does. It's character loss. You actually lose that agency in play. Now, those, as I say, are not widely regarded as desirable things in role-playing, and yet here we're saying they are.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that I think is worth, it's worth reflecting on that. It's worth saying, interesting. We have a whole sector of role-playing, and it is a big freaking sector. I mean, I'm looking through my shelves, and there's more games with this particular model and variants on it than there aren't. It's really widespread.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so you're like, wow, this is a piece of role playing. It is not unlikely that if somebody's writing up a game and without reflecting on it very much will say, okay, I need sanity rules. And they're thinking about something on this model that they're going to put in to have that. And I named a couple of more obscure games, and they just go on and on. I mean, Albedo, which we talked about in the science fiction, has breakdowns, meltdowns of different kinds, and remember, self-image was a huge variable in there. The character's self-image would go up and down and could actually really negatively impact roles in doing things. So okay, we're having and also it's fairly substantive, isn't it? I mean, it is a pretty substantive element of your character. It's not a quirk. It's not a detail. I mean, this is how your character is going to be played.
Mm-hmm.
Now remember I said there was a whole parallel and alternate track going on here?
Mm-hmm.
That whole parallel and alternate track has its origins not in Call of Cthulhu, but in Dungeons and Dragons. And that was the rules for going Berserk.
Yeah.
Now, the tricky thing about it was that it was almost always accompanied by significant bonuses in battle.
Yep.
Whether rolls to hit were improved, depended on the rule set we were talking about, or the games that picked up on this. Improved rolls to hit, ignoring if you had like heavy wound effects, like you take this much damage, then you drop this amount of effectiveness and stuff. Ignoring that, lots of different things that you got for being Berserk. And many players, as I recall, considering we were 15, this was nothing but a gift from the gods to, be more effective in a fight. After all, who cares if you were frothing and crazy in Berserk and killing anything you could? Because isn't that kind of how you were playing your character in a fight anyway? So,
So is that the only effect? There's no the GM takes over or anything like that?
Well, that became, again, we're talking about many, many, many different rule sets during, especially way back then, during an era when what you did at the table was kind of whatever happened at that table. And those were the rules.
Yeah, I've seen the videos, Ron.
Yeah,
I've seen your videos.
So I can't. I mean, that's a qualifier. I will say that in my experience, it was something of a debate. In the rules, it says you attack the nearest individual, but that didn't mean that the other player was very happy when either that player or the DM said, "Okay, now you attack him." They would often sort of lawyer themselves out of that in one fashion or another, or make themselves sufficiently obnoxious that, all right, he doesn't because we're tired of listening to you. And so, but what I'm saying is there was a certain amount of...
It did happen in some of our games, though, so yeah.
And so, I mean, it all looks very well and good on paper to say, your character loses control over who they attack, blah, blah, blah. But really what you wanted was just to go berserk and kill crazy and get bonuses. You didn't really want that to happen. So, as long as we all kind of, say, oh, yeah, he ducks out of the way. So next person you see, oh, it's another goblin. Well, so, that sort of thing happened. And I noticed that as Dungeons and Dragons proceeded, with the huge, big, gaping hole in my understanding that is second edition, because I just Nobody has paid me to go and waltz into that swamp and attempt to understand the range of second edition. I mean, I'm pretty good with a few of the campaign packages that I liked, but not with the nuts and bolts of all those kinds of rules.
Played a huge lot of it, but mostly because we went from first to second edition AD&D, and we played mostly the AD&D during my D&D gaming tenure.
By the time third edition came around, Berserk really doesn't have any downside. And it's more of a feat that the barbarian gets and other characters don't, that is basically just a class feature.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, I remember playing third edition and kind of blinking and saying, wait a minute, that's it? You know? but you're not crazy. And this is kind of important because, again, we're talking about a character acting out, a character losing it, a character being bonkers. And even though there's all this negotiation that we're being snarky about with people trying to weasel out of the bad side, still, it is in many ways an acknowledgement that your character losing control is a good thing. And various forms of Berserk through the ages of gaming are grapple with that, you know. Yes, we want it to be cool that it's a macho thing. You go Berserk and you are more effective, and it's very much a matter of catharsis, and very much a matter of mayhem. And to say that this is, restricted to teenage boys playing D&D is ridiculous. It's a primary feature of every action movie ever made for the hero. I mean, this is a big deal in the way we do things. And so the thing I'm getting at now is to look at the game that I'm currently most engaged with for financial reasons, which is Champions. And the first generation of Champions had a disadvantage called Berserk. It also had a disadvantage called psychological limitations. And these things are kind of nuances of the same thing. But you could take a psychological limitation which did not affect the character's behavior in any way except the way you wanted. So it was basically an opinion. And whether you took action on it was completely up to you. How much you took action on it was completely up to you. And it was, it was uncommon, common, or very common, or something like that. And then you could rack it up by giving it an irrational response. Then you could rack it up to the top by giving it a full meltdown character becomes dysfunctional response. And I'm know from experience that the way people played these was often not particularly careful about the rule. So that basically they said, well, my character really believes it, so I get 30 points. You're kind of like, where's the meltdown? And they're like, what are you talking about? He believes it. 30 points. Okay. So people were often not really all that good about it, but at least it was there as a concept. And then there was Berserk, which was attacking the next thing that moved. And in Champions, actually, people tended to play that a little bit more faithfully to literally attacking who's ever nearby, because they had Wolverine and the Hulk to go by. And having them around, you could always say, okay, we're in it. This is what we're doing. And pretty soon, that sort of game version of Berserk became codified back into the comics, and in the comics based on the games and stuff like that. So it became part of the whole hobby language, the whole gamer and comics language of what Berserk is. GURPS had exactly the same rule, and there were others. Most games off of that trajectory of design, of which Vampire is one as well, have that frenzy is basically Berserk. In some ways. And then Champions, in one of its editions, people finally got tired of their characters being completely bonkers. And in one of the supplements to third edition, they let you dial it down to Enrage, where you only went after the target that triggered it. And so, it was tricky. that gets compounded with the difficulty of killing attacks in that game, which were its own thing. But it led to all manner of difficulties when you had a Berserk and your character had a killing attack, and yet you had some psychological limitation that was an ethical thing. Then the debates began at the table, and they were not easy. They were, my character would, the rules say this, on and on and on and on. In fact, I would say that was one of my big red flags for a group. Whenever that got going at the table, I walked, because that showed that everybody was confused and not really wanting to know otherwise. But do you see how that's kind of another one of these trajectories in design, in terms of your character losing it, and there being a curious relationship between it being a bad thing and for it to have its utility in some fashion. And that goes back to Call of Cthulhu with the improved lore roll and stuff like that. So, so do you see how we're really seeing quite a lot of different ways in which the losing your marbles temporarily or more permanently, defining, more locked down things about your character, also seems to have these weird upsides to it, and in many ways is embraced. There are reasons why people are embracing them as part of play, to the extent where, as I said, it really is a little shocking. I finally realized that I probably have more role-playing games with that in that than I have without. So did you guys ever hear another mid-90s game called Asylum? No. It was very obscure. So. And it sort of prided itself on having a lot of clinical definitions of insanity. And and then another thing was that every character was insane. And then, so basically it was kind of like jumping in the end stage of Call of Cthulhu. And I cannot remember what the basic setting antagonists or situations were. Its little gimmick, though, was that the resolution system meant that you had so many marbles and you put them in the jar, and then you had to reach into the jar and get out your marbles and see, and you lost marbles, So
you literally lost your marbles.
Yeah, exactly. So, but to me, it was a whole lot of effort for one little verbal joke, but But anyway, that gives you an idea. The model that we're talking about was sufficiently interesting or established that it became the basis for games like that.
One example of that is not exactly insanity, but is kind of related, is the stress mechanics in Blaze in the Dark.
Yes. And I was also thinking along those lines of Headspace. Because and what's interesting about those two things is that, actually, let's get to the Blades in the Dark in just a sec. You said it first, so we'll do that first. Sorry. We'll get to Blades in the Dark. Tell me about it, and tell me what right.
So in Blaze in the Dark, every character has a track of stress that you fill up. Every time you roll, you pre-establish the consequences of the roll if you fail or succeed partially. And if you do, the consequences happen. And the GM tells you, like, you trip, you fall down the window, or you get stabbed, you are dead, or whatever. And then you can say, actually, fuck you, I resist that. In which case you have like a series of attributes that determine that called attributes, and you roll your lowest one. You roll the one that is appropriate. There's one for like physical stuff, mental stuff, social stuff. You roll the appropriate, and that gives you a number of dice. You roll 6-sided dice. You take the highest. Result, and you subtract that from 6. For example, if you get a 3, you subtract that from 6, you get 3 stress. If you roll a 6, no stress at all.
But what about
And
the accumulated? What are the effects of accumulated stress? I've actually played Blades in the Dark, but not for a long time. I mean, we didn't play for a while.
sure. So one important thing is that in every role, every time there's a consequence, which is very often, stress is always an option. It's always there. They're nagging at you. And the other stuff is once you feel your stress track, you lose your shit. Like the job, the stress becomes too much for you. If you are in the middle of battle, you get taken out, and you mark up permanent. I think like a scar or something like that. I don't remember the name right now. But it's something like there's a few to choose, and there are things like you are cold now. Or
as a matter of fact, I think we played pretty intensely when like for a couple sessions in a day, and somebody got that far.
Yeah.
So I remember somebody getting a scar. Yeah.
Yeah, and once you get one of those, basically you receive XP and at the end of sessions if you play into them.
Right.
And the other interesting stuff is to recover stress, to clean stress. The main way is to indulge into your vice, which is something
that's a classic. Yeah, Blades in the Dark has components that come from a number of other games, and I'm sort of restraining myself from footnoting, all of these details that you're
mentioning. Like I'm reading, I'm like, oh yeah, Burning Wheel, Troll Wave. Oh, this is so cool how it makes it.
Well, John's usually really, really good about footnoting it himself. So I'm not claiming anything.
Yeah. There's a list at the beginning.
The refreshing by indulging your vice was brought to. It didn't originate, but it was made very popular to the Forge community, of which John was one, by the Shadow of Yesterday.
But, sure. I mean, I think that could count as a big influence in John's work.
So if we take a look at some other aspects of this, though, one thing we find is the potential, mechanics-wise, first of all, for Death Spiral, which becomes less fun sometimes. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing, but one has a tendency to wonder, okay, well, why can't we just get to it? Why torture me, by making it, you lose hope halfway through in a Death Spiral. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's that. And then another one is the desirability of what happens and how often. So the stress thing as something that happens once in a while, or the irrational behavior in a champion psychological limitation, things like that. But when they sort of, blindside you and ambush you every single time you freaking play, your character becomes kind of spastic and not so much fun to be around and not so much fun to play. So those are all kind of considerations, design considerations. The pacing of these relative to other events in play becomes quite an art.
Yeah.
And
I think one of the reasons of why it works in Blades is because there's such a focus on the gang.
Yes.
That losing your character, I mean, it's something you don't want to happen, but it's not such a big deal. You don't lose everything.
Right. You continue to play in the gang. So yeah. So yes, all of these are definitely considerations. The one when I thought of Headspace, which is very much a stress track. Let's not forget Inspectors, of course. Inspectors has stress. There's a shared pool, which is the symbolic resources of the company. And when you get stress, it penalizes all your roles. So the more stressed you are, basically, the less competent you are. And you can relieve stress by pulling from the company pool, using up company resources. And so, and although things you do contribute that completing missions contributes to the pool, but it's pretty clear, you feel, look, I'm the one who helped make this happen and I'm totally stressed out. I deserve a little something, out of this. And since being able to take it out cannot be opposed by other characters or players, You see, you get this whole thing of, that's the company money, what are you doing? Well, I need it. And so it's sort of built to put some tension into those factors, to those dynamics of play.
Jesus.
So
Budgeting horror, I would call it.
Actually, I was going to say Inspectors is beautiful. It's not the Ghostbusters game. Oh, I hate that so much. It's not the Ghostbusters game. It is the company.com game.
Yeah.
And it's really, really, really good at that. So that's kind of interesting. The idea that we're talking about stress. You see how we sort of shifted from sanity as a clinical device to stress that anybody could have. That's where the madness meters in Unknown Armies are kind of a transition between talking about being genuinely nuts in some way or in risk of it versus being kind of stressed. The madness meters kind of can get you into the insanity realm, but they operate in the moment more like stress. So the game I was thinking of too, which is again me and my obscure games, from Kathleen and Joe Williams, who are more underappreciated game designers. One of their games is called Chaotic, and it's spelled with a K, K-H. And it is a science fiction game in which your characters go on missions. They're usually missions in another dimension, a horrific science fiction war-torn dimension. And the team gets their minds beamed into the body of one of the cyber monsters there. And everybody gets their mind beamed into the same body. So playing is one character in, the meat space of play, in the actual, one being wandering around doing things. But you've got all the player characters in the head, and although they could operate harmoniously, there are times when they don't. And if that's when the players say, no, don't do that, or I'm taking over and stuff like that. And you can actually have the being itself can be, in that sense, bonkers, but also the impact on your character in terms of sanity is affected. Anybody who is familiar with Roger Zelazny's book, Eye of Cat, can find a pretty canonical science fiction form of this phenomenon.
That's really interesting that game exists, because that actually made me think about this game.
Oh, really? Okay. Tell me more about that then.
Oh, you don't know about this one?
I'm saying you brought it up. You share.
Sure. So this is Bluebird's Bride. It's a game in which you retell the tale, the classic gothic tale of bluebirds, and you play as the bride. Each character plays as one part of the conscience of the psyche.
Right.
Psyche of the bride. And it's a horror game. It's female horror, and it is that kind of that thing of a few players controlling the same character.
Right.
It does that. Yeah.
Right. Now, the interesting thing I found when I, in desperation at a convention, actually did some sorcerer runs with multiple people, like a couple, 3 people playing one protagonist, was that didn't have to reflect any dysfunctional aspects of the protagonist. It actually just make them a fairly complex person. And everybody was interested in that. Having multiple agents in one fictional body isn't necessarily going to do what we're talking about. But obviously, we're looking at games in which the edgier capacities of that situation are desirable. So that the bride is, for lack of a better word, non-optimized or conflicted.
Yes, that's the word, conflicted.
And in the case of the monster in Chaotic, you don't really care about the monster as a character, the body that you're in as a character. But the interactions among the team are very important, because if they don't operate, thoughtfully. And it's also important that this is a very Cold War game. They come from different nations, so there's sort of built-in animosities at that level as well. So working together as such, and especially because their boss isn't very trustworthy, it becomes kind of important for the team to sort of figure out how to get along.
Is there any way for like one of the characters to die or something else,
Yes.
and the others continue in the body?
Yes, and then it's very traumatic. And the same thing, and this is why you can see there's some similarities to Headspace, in that if one character melts down, the others are affected.
Shit, I have to check if that game is referenced in this one, because in the Bluebird's Bride, when one character gets one of the sides of the bride gets shattered, it is pretty traumatic, and that player basically starts helping the GM push horror.
Right. That realm of sort of shared headspace, I think, is not isolated to just those games. I think that's a minor family in role-playing. And I don't know if Chaotic was the first. Then there's the idea of playing in realities that aren't trustworthy. And we already see that a little bit with Call of Cthulhu in a sort of existential intellectual way, and in a more literal, like, as you say, Clive Barker-ish way in Cult. And then there are any number of other games which play with sanity as a means of piercing the veil of the lie. I mean, reality being more of a lie than the way it is. And so insanity being a quality of actually operating beyond it. Now, Mage is a shared consensus reality game.
Yeah.
And one of its supplements, which is, and I think it's even called the Book of Madness, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so.
Is pretty explicit, and actually, not being the world's biggest fan of Mage, and I say that without blame or objective criticism, so that's a personal statement. I really liked that book, though. Even though a lot of the characters in there were kind of presented as sort of going too far, and this is a way to do things where you might run into characters who are like this, and these are the ones who've gone off the range and everything. And I remember reading it and saying, well, I want to play this. These are the only interesting characters I've ever run across. These are the ones that I want to do this game. And so anyway, though, so I would want to go back and investigate it, but they, as I recall, had some pretty interesting methods in that supplement. Then to stick with the White Wolf stuff, of course, don't forget your first Wraith.
Oh yeah.
And do you remember do you remember the mechanic in Wraith, Herman?
There was at least the one with the shadow played by some other person at the table.
Right. Everybody. It was basically your character's bad side.
Yeah.
That and as I think it was really cool. Didn't all they do? They actually couldn't take over, or maybe I can't remember, but they talked to you. That was the creepy thing. The shadow was always. I can't remember if there was any mechanic involved, except for their ability to talk to you about what your shadow side wanted you to do.
Yeah.
Now, along those lines, are you familiar with Zach Arnson's game for kids? God help us all. Called Shadows, and it is a little kid protagonist, and it is to be played by a little kid and an adult, and the character, the little kid actually says what the bad advice person, or being or toy or whatever will advise them to do. And then they have to decide whether they're going to do it or not. Which, if it sounds really, really disturbing, well, all I'm told is that kids really like it. But I was kind of like, yeah, they might. I'm not sure I will. But Little Fears is also important because there are elements of the character's psyche that became elements of play. I'm trying to remember. I don't think that the little kids could actually. Ooh, yeah, they could. There was actually kind of a diminished humanity mechanic that was along the lines of vampire, or there were ways for your character to waste away. There were ways for your character to be scarred, by what was going on. So yeah, those were, but as I recall, those were a little more like damage than anything else, although they were psychological.
Mm-hmm.
There is clearly a zone of functional play here. There's a zone of saying we want things in our fiction whereby the otherwise sacred agency of me over my character, which I would fight and kill for under any other circumstances. This is where I really like voluntarily, and even perhaps with anticipation, give it up.
I think we are talking about Monster Hearts here.
Well, Monster Hearts certainly is in there. Yeah, for sure. I mean, but Darkest Self is very much a feature of this. So completely. And so this is a very important point, because I'm saying that Monster Hearts is part of the rule, not the exception, that this has a cathartic quality rather than a punishment quality.
Yeah.
And some of the designs slip into more of a punishment mechanic, and some of the designs may have pacing problems by which this happens too much for fun relative to everything else, which is obviously a very difficult design decision, of how do you, make this causal? How do you, play it out? Or how often, in what way does this actually happen? So anyway, those are some of my thoughts, but I really wanted to get at that idea of the desired side of these things. And if you were to start looking around, there's so many little obscure games that have different things. I also mentioned one thing I didn't follow up on was the many, the piercing the veil of realities. Another one that follows in that direction is I've mentioned it in the science fiction discussions as well, called Psychosis, Ship of Fools, where the characters are all deluded into a particular dream existence, and they actually have to work their way individually through the layers of more and more and more realistic or situations or realities that are closer and closer and closer to the actual reality, which is that they're on a generation ship which has gone off course and they have to course correct and all that. But the important thing is that the characters do this at different paces. And they also, and internally, they may feel as though they're going completely insane. Why am I seeing, green dragons? Why am I, or rather, you start in a fantasy setting. Why am I seeing, computer consoles? Am I going crazy?
One we haven't revisited is Don't Raise Your Head.
Right. You mentioned it. And this one is very much more of a dream state kind of
normal
crazy things from my dreams are pursuing me kind of thing.
Yeah, the play happens in this kind of dream space or dream alternative reality. Basically, I'm going to try to remember you have different pools of dices. One of them is your tiredness dice or something like that, and like the more you use it, the bigger chance there is that you get more and more of getting more, something like that. And at some point, if you get too many of those or you lose too many of those or something like that, you wake up.
Right. There was a three-cornered dice mechanic, as I recall, that the three pools fed into each other and competed with one another and stuff like that.
Something like that, yeah.
Now, there was another game that has never been completed, or more accurately, never published, by Ralph Mazza, called Robots and Rapiers. And Robots and Rapiers, you are playing robots in a fantasy park. A park for people to come and play the Three Musketeers. And your
So
robots.
Westworld, but then Musketeer.
I'm sorry, what?
Westworld, but then with
Yeah,
Musketeers.
absolutely. But this is the important part. You're not playing the people. You're playing the robots. And not only that, but the people are long gone, so the robots are just doing this over and over again. And the important point is that in the first part of play, you have little or no capacity to not play the pre-programmed adventure that you've played so many times before. And yet, through a variety of mechanical events, your characters start springing their screws. And through a very graded process per character, ultimately you're going to be in a situation where your character is completely free-willed. And the GM has no ability to mandate what your character does or what part they're supposed to play or anything. And of course, Cardinal Richelieu is a robot who has gone through this, but wants to run the joint. Right. And so,
I know someone, and this is like just an idea that they had, so I don't want to. But they had an idea of kind of the opposite, where you play robots or androids that basically lose their free will as they go, like to be able to do some stuff, they have to renounce to some of their free will,
right.
and they start losing the capacity to do stuff.
Interesting.
Yeah,
now, in this case, what I found was it was really super fun to be halfway through the process. So the characters were still mandated to do things like, the mission to go save the Queen's handmaiden from being kidnapped by the Cardinal's men, and, how that was going to mess with the deal between France and England and all that sort of thing. But the characters were quirky enough and had gone through weird things enough and had their own opinions on things enough that your behavior was a weird seesawing back between doing things you wanted and being on the mission. And so you got what ended up being almost a caper comedy of very incompetent musketeers, for, reasons that, from that perspective would make no sense. But from a more dramatic perspective, you were actually like watching these emergent personalities kind of develop into what they might become. And so, but it was really fun to play at that point, partly because you were kind of freed from consequence. You were freed of the planned consequence of the mission, but you weren't good enough or able to get out of it enough to be really responsible for what it was you were implementing. So there was that. But I should also point out that Ralph wrote that game almost as a deliberate training ground to break you of railroading habits, or more accurately, to break you of railroaded habits, to denormalize railroading. So that was sort of his. I'm not sure if he really meant it to be literal gamer therapy in that regard, but he definitely wanted, the whole thing was a huge commentary on precisely that dynamic. But again, I really enjoyed playing it when the characters were in and out of my control in a way that made a lot of sense to me. And often the results, just like in this stage of Call of Cthulhu, were sometimes kind of goofy. Right. To kick it to you guys, what then, are we too hidebound in this? Do we have too few models for this and so many variations on the same model? What's untouched, or maybe touched only in like one or two games that you've ever encountered, if any? What's another way to manage this, to think about it, for it to be fun and play, or even think about what it is?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember.
I mean, one thing that maybe we should consider is kind of what do we want to get out of this kind of thing? Do we want to get some kind of fear of something close to fear of, am I close to getting insane? Like that fear of I'm getting close to this, or do we want to enjoy I'm going crazy now?
Right.
Let's go crazy.
Right. There's a fictional. It's fun. It's fictional crazy after all, right?
Yeah.
So, and I agree. Those are two sort of competing dynamics or desires or approaches. I mentioned black comedy before, which is kind of a way to reconcile them. But
I mean, there's some interesting stuff like Dread, for example, the one that uses the Jenga tower. Yeah. I mean, that one is literally making you crazy, like with tension. Like that's physical, or this is going to fall kind of tension. So that's like a very interesting way to do it. It's almost kind of cheating because you are doing something that is
right. Well, but it is still pretty fictional because, frankly, when all is said and done, who cares? But still, it by all accounts, it is a game that succeeds reasonably well at that end. So,
and then you have the recent Star Cross that uses that mechanics for dates. Basically, you actually, and when the tower falls, is that you kiss, like that the dating finishes and you finally kiss. But yeah,
that's star-crossed lovers.
Just
something like that. It's a
Star-crossed.
Yeah, Star-crossed. I think
it was recently kickstarted. Anyway, that's kind of like a whole different thing.
All right. Well, there is, I think, a wide range of things we could, pull in. Over the Edge had a number of attempts along these lines. The supplements like Wildest Dreams and stuff like that kind of went in this direction. I'm sure as we continue, we'll keep running into different ideas.
One thing, like one idea that I had for some stuff is to try to have this kind of corporative horror.
Right.
And the idea was that you had these two kind of states of play, kind of like daylight and yeah, I don't remember how it came up, but basically you are doing your stuff, your cool badass stuff that you really want to do, and you have to take care of work and the things that they throw at you. And basically, I thought that there could be some kind of mechanics that would allow you to flip. So suddenly you were, I was thinking this in some kind of cyberpunk setting. So suddenly you were trying to hack into the mainframes of the company you work with to sabotage it. And at that moment, a roll fails or whatever, and we turn the game, and suddenly the GM is like, yeah, well, you receive a call and there's an emergency on the servers and you have to fix it now.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. That is kind of cool. Left Coast plays with that a little bit, with the science fiction writers of Southern California coping with the rent at the same time as they're bursting with visions. So they're like writing hack bullshit at the same time as they're writing, brilliant visionary stuff, and they're, torn between all this. Now, I was thinking that I actually have delved into this fairly ambitiously with my game Estimated Profit, which also draws upon some aspects of the Philip K. Dick and variety of things, but instead of going with the tropes that are usually associated with him, I actually said, let's go for it. Let's actually put ourselves into the hypnagogic artistic state of visions and make things, and either ruin or transcend our lives by doing so for the characters. And the devices I use for it are fairly ambitious too. Strangely enough, and much to my shock, the game has been multiply play tested successfully. And I am wondering if I've done a good deed, but that game is in many ways my foray into madness. Particularly because I see no great distinction between schizophrenia and visionary religious certainty. But the question then is that a bad thing when that's precisely that state that produces, bizarrely wonderful art? So,
I think that's one of the ways to go about it, to kind of try to put you in that kind of mental state, one way or the other.
There is a game in the first round of Ronnie's contests, all the way back in 2005, done by Keith Sinkowski, and it was untitled. And he designed the game as a found object, like somebody left a folder behind on the subway. And he handmade a bunch of copies. And one of the reasons I think that it didn't really sell well or get played much was because what he wrote or what he made as a product was all too successful at looking like something that somebody left behind on the subway. I still have mine. And in order to understand the rules, you had to read the ravings, and stuff like that, and figure out how that translated into dice. And so, on the other hand, it was a really, really horrific experience. The game was built to put you in the state of mind of somebody who had snapped, and either, speaking objectively, you either sympathized with a Berserk but effectively morally right lab rat who's striking out in every possible direction, or you're playing somebody who is so badly unhinged they probably should be chemically controlled and sequestered for the rest of their lives. So you're not really sure. And the game is particularly good at getting you into literally that state of mind. So with Estimated Profit and with Keith's game, I'm looking for games at the moment. I'm thinking of the games I can think of that actually induce the states rather than merely characterize characters as such.
I remember playing a Penny for Your Thoughts.
Right.
I think it's called.
Right.
Which is about it's a while since we ran it, but which is sort of like on one side it's like a group of people undergoing a psychological treatment, and on the other hand, their delusions or maybe reality or whatever's happened to them to get them to the point, if I remember right, because it's been
right. Well, it's as I recall, it has a great deal with memory recovery and acknowledging responsibility and stuff like that. Yeah. Meg completed it, correct? It was started by one group and then Meg completed it. Is that correct? Do I remember correctly?
Might be. Okay. Don't quite remember it. It had actual pennies where you were supposed to give the penny for your thoughts kind of thing at some point in the game.
There's a Spanish game called Paciente 13, Patient 13, which I haven't read. I've only heard of people playing it. But for what I've heard, it's all about teaching the GM and giving techniques to the GM to induce this kind of mental states to the players, using kind of tricks like lighting, music. It's kind of like the usual GM bullshit that they use in Call of Cthulhu games.
Right, right. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a dubious set of techniques, isn't it? But yeah.
Maybe I'll have to check it out, because
for all we know, the characterization is unfair and it has some interesting,
I think there's probably it probably has some interesting stuff. I just don't know but I think it's around these kind of techniques to put you to confuse the players and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because in the two games I was talking about, you embrace it. I mean, nobody can make you do it, feel it, operate upon it. You actually have to kind of dive in. So yeah, those are sort of the closest I've come. I'll have to think about it. As usual with these seminars, we think of 20 things afterwards, that fit. But those are sort of the realms that I've found. I'm sure if there were a couple of others, whole families, I mean, not examples of the same things, but which are always welcome, but whole families or concepts of this for play. And we've just completely forgotten about it because, we just did, then I hope somebody else brings it up. Because we're not talking, I've said it before, we're not talking about trivial feature of the hobby.
Yeah.
Clearly, just like magic,
Mm-hmm.
this is a thing. This is
Yeah.
one of the realms of operation that the hobby has explored, design-wise, experience-wise.
Yeah.